researcher at Ghent University, and in the past I did some work on estimating the impact of nosocomial infections in critically ill patients, albeit mostly in the field of bacteremia and candidemia and multi-drug resistance, and less on ventilator-associated pneumonia. I have no conflicts of interest in this regard. So, the impact of FAP on prognosis are mainly focused on two things. You have mortality, of course, and you have morbidity. I will focus this talk on mortality. Morbidity is mostly among cost determinants like length of stay, etc., but I will focus this talk on mortality. And it has been mentioned before by Jean, this is a very controversial issue. And why is it like that? There are plenty of bias possible in this regard. You have plenty of methodological approaches, all with their pros and cons. And last but not least, there is a wide range of results on attributable mortality in literature, ranging from close to zero to dramatic 50% excess mortality. So, the first thing I want to mention is the issue about discriminating associated mortality from attributable mortality. In critical illness, you know that this brings with you an increased risk of infection, but also an increased risk of mortality. And it's very important to understand that this is independent from each other. You do not need an infection to die in the ICU. So there clearly is an assumption that there is a relationship between disease severity on one hand and the risk of infection on the other hand. And of course we all know that disease severity is a very good surrogate marker of your risk of death in the ICU or later on in the hospital. So, what we will try to do with this kind of approaches in this kind of research is to discriminate the mortality that is due to general disease severity and acute illness from the mortality that can really be attributed at the complication under investigation, which is ventilator-associated pneumonia today. And I must say that this is a very, very tricky exercise, because as you know, in the ICU, and especially in patients with sepsis, mortality is very often a result of a cascade of complications from which it is very difficult to discriminate the cause and result from each other. So this is a very difficult exercise. So I will now go over some of the confounding factors that you should take into account if you do your exercise at home. So critical illness is very often the combination between underlying conditions on one hand and the acute illness on the other hand. And it's very important that I want to stress this, that both have an impact on the complication and the further days, because a patient without underlying conditions will recover much more easy from a complication than a patient with underlying conditions. And on the other hand, the patient with underlying conditions will most probably have a higher risk of some complications like pneumonia. So you should not take only into account the severity of acute illness, but also underlying diseases. Now, lucky as we are, researchers before our time, I should say, have summarized severity of underlying conditions and acute illness in severity of disease classification systems like the Apache 2 score. Apache 2 score is more than the score on itself with points you get from severity of illness. No, you get points also for your underlying conditions. And more importantly, and a lot of people forget it often, the score should be linked with a very specific principal diagnosis leading to ICU admission. And this is very important, because an Apache 2 score of 15 in a patient admitted for head trauma is totally different from an Apache 2 score of 15 in a patient admitted for cardiac arrest. You need and the score and the principal diagnosis leading to ICU admission to come to the expected mortality calculation. And that's what we need if we really want to adjust for underlying conditions and severity of disease. So, does baseline disease severity affect the attributable mortality of ventilator-associated pneumonia? Yes, indeed. However, most of you might think in the first place that the impact will be more heavy in those who are very sick on admission, but it's actually not true. These are just 3 studies I selected, indicating that the impact of ventilator-associated pneumonia is actually lower in the most severely sick patients on admission. And the reason for that is probably that if you enter the ICU with an expected mortality of 80%, 85%, it doesn't matter whether you have several complications or not. You are probably going to die, unfortunately. That's the truth. Whereas the impact in patients with a very good prognosis of a severe complication might be much more heavy. But what about, because I talked in this previous slide about baseline severity of disease when you enter the ICU, the first 24 hours. But you know that disease severity changes during the course of the ICU, and then you develop ventilator-associated pneumonia. Is this important? Well, we all know that these differences might be important. You can assume that VAP develops especially in patients doing worse over time in the ICU. And therefore, some studies adjust for severity of disease the day before or even 3 days before they acquire ventilator-associated pneumonia. On the other hand, you should realize that these very accurate scoring systems like SAPS-2 and Apache-2, they predict in-hospital mortality irrespective of your length of stay in the ICU, whether you are in the ICU for 3 days or 33 days. Take this into account. So probably, that's my personal opinion, but as I told you, there's a lot of controversy about this. If you match on disease severity on admission, and you have very good tools for that, and you take into account your length of ICU stay, you're probably very close to the reality. So what about length of stay? Nosocomial infection generally occurs in patients with a longer length of stay than average. So you should take this into account. And many people at first sight think that the people with a long ICU stay have a very bad outcome because they are very sick. Yes and no. Of course, these patients are not the ones with very low severity of disease, otherwise they will not be in the ICU for 2 or 3 weeks. But at least these patients survived the acute phase. And that's one of the very tricky issues, because this might induce what we call survival bias. And I just selected this study. It's not a very important study, but it's a study that marvelously illustrates the risk of survival bias. Single-center study from Ghent ICU. Only here taking into account patients who are ventilated more than 2 days. That's your population you're focusing on. And you see here that, in fact, mortality was 20%, where is my pointer? 20% in patients with VAP, 31% in patients without ventilator-associated pneumonia. And when you look in more detail to this cohort, you saw that in VAP there was more trauma. We can understand that. They had a longer length of stay. And here there was more immunosuppression and a shorter length of stay. Fortunately, and I will come to this study later, after adjustment for differences in the cohorts, this difference was no longer significant. But this perfectly illustrates how tricky this all is. Of course, it doesn't make sense that you have a better outcome in patients with ventilator-associated pneumonia, but sometimes it just looks like that. So, does pathogen and multi-drug resistance affect the outcome? Well, very tricky as well. This is a very arbitrary, I must say, very arbitrary split between high and low virulence pathogens and pathogens that have a likelihood of being resistant or not. It's very arbitrary. The high virulence in the pathogen is mostly linked with your pathophysiological impact of the infection, while the drug resistance impacts on your percentage, your chance of having appropriate empiric antimicrobial therapy. And this is important because we know that the more multi-drug resistance there is, the higher the likelihood that you will miss the causative pathogen, and this will compromise the odds of survival. So the question here is, should we adjust for empiric inappropriate therapy in this research question? Well, yes and no. I would say if multi-drug resistance impacts on your rate of empiric appropriate therapy, it's just part of the game. It is just like that in reality. But of course, at this time while doing so, you do not measure only the impact of resistance, but also the impact of missing your appropriate empiric therapy. But there is a methodological issue as well, because as a rule of thumb, in logistic regression models, for instance, it is forbidden to adjust for variables that are in between the biological pathway between onset of the complication, onset of VAP, and the outcome. It is just not done. So actually, in a strict sense, you may not adjust for inappropriate therapy. Is it really forbidden? No. I would recommend you, if you report something like that, to just report in your paper 2 regression models, one with and one without adjustment for inappropriate therapy. And then it's up to the reader of the paper to judge which he thinks is more important. VAP definition, we have heard this before. Of course, you can assume a relationship between a very strict diagnostic certainty, which is probably linked with a higher impact of the infection than when you're talking about perhaps ventilator-associated tracheobronchitis. It's not very much documented in ventilator-associated pneumonia, but this is very well known in invasive aspergillosis, where you have these very classical things like proven, probable, possible. And it's always clear from literature that mortality in proven and probable invasive aspergillosis is much higher than in possible invasive aspergillosis. But there is no such thing as this patient has possible invasive aspergillosis. You have it or you don't have it. So the degree of certainty of your diagnosis is important, and you should take it into account. As a researcher, I think it is the most important to be consequent with the definition you use. So what are the methodological approaches? I'm just focusing on 2 main things, cohort studies and matched cohort studies. Cohort studies can be prospective, preferably, or eventually retrospective. In a rule, they include all cases admitted in the ICU, which is good because you will decrease your risk of selection bias. On the other hand, while selecting all your patients entering in the ICU, you will have a very great variety in case mix, which is a problem for adjustment on itself. And then you can adjust for confounding factors by, very classically, logistic regression or Cox regression. And this statistical analysis will give you independent associations between your risk factor and the binary outcome, which is mortality. And then you have multi-state models, which is already much more complex, and I would not recommend that if you are just a clinician trying to do some research. For multi-state models, you really need a statistical team behind you, and certainly you need this for causal inference analysis. These are really extremely advanced and complex statistics that you should classify among the do not do this at home statistics. So some of these studies I will go over now, very short. This is the study with the survival bias risk that I showed you earlier. So we had a cohort of 1,300 patients, of which nearly 400 were ventilated. 1,300 patients ventilated. I'm sorry. There were nearly 300 patients with ventilator-associated pneumonia in the subset of those who were ventilated for more than 2 days. I'm sorry for the confusion. In the total cohort, it was clear that ventilator-associated mortality had a significantly higher risk of death, 20% versus 12%. But when we focused on those ventilated for more than 2 days, and I showed this before, it was turned around. It was 20% for VAP, 31% for non-ventilator-associated pneumonia patients. And after logistic regression adjustment, we were very fortunate that we could report that there was actually no difference in mortality, as you can see over here. But this was what a negative odds ratio for ventilator-associated pneumonia. So actually no difference in mortality at all on basis of this study. This is a multi-center study on French data, 12 French ICUs providing high-quality data, nearly 3,000 mechanically ventilated patients, 15% with ventilator-associated pneumonia. The simple observed mortality, 27% versus 19%. And they used mainly two different approaches to estimate the impact of ventilator-associated pneumonia. They used, first of all, a multi-state progressive disability model, and this is the kind of model that takes into account that you just cannot say these patients have VAP and these patients do not have VAP. No, because they enter the ICU both as non-VAP patients. And after some days, some do develop it and others do not. And this kind of statistics takes this element into account. This study found an attributable mortality of ventilator-associated pneumonia of 8%. Interestingly, this kind of statistics may show you that there was a difference in impact over time. As you can see on the figure, those who developed VAP very early during their disease course had no impact of the infection, while actually it went up to nearly 10% in patients who developed VAP at a later stage. And then, with the same cohort, these researchers performed a conditional logistic regression model on a matched cohort. They matched patients with VAP with non-VAP patients on the duration of mechanical ventilation. And based on this analysis, they found an attributable mortality of 10%, but with wide variation between 6 and 25 in the confidence intervals. And they concluded, actually, that this kind of conditional matched logistic regression analysis overestimated the true impact of ventilator-associated pneumonia, and they had more interest actually in the multi-state model as being more closely to the reality. They did some sensitivity analysis as well. The impact of ventilator-associated pneumonia was higher among surgical patients and those with an intermediate SAPS-2 score, indicating not the very sick patients. And the impact of VAP was not increased among the medical patients who usually have higher severity of disease classification scores, those with high SAP scores, and there is also no impact of high-level resistance such as Staph aureus, MRSA, or Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So this is the study that changed a lot, actually, and brought a lot of controversy in this field. It's from data from the Outcome REA project here in France, study with over 4,000 patients, VAP present in 15%. And this is this very advanced statistics. It's a competing risk survival analysis considering discharge as a competing risk with ICU mortality in this cohort. It's a marginal structural modeling approach taking into account adjustment for time-varying disease severity. This cohort was very detailed, and the researchers were able to monitor disease severity from onset until the development of the ventilator-associated pneumonia, or not. So what this study revealed was that the population attributable fraction of ICU mortality after 30 days in the ICU was only 4%, and after 60 days it was nearly 6%. Now this is 6% of the total ICU mortality. It's not the attributable mortality. When you relate this figure to the total mortality, about 23%, you came out of an attributable mortality of only 1 to 1.5%. Very difficult. Take note that these researchers checked out the impact of appropriate antibiotic treatment, less than 1% difference. Very difficult result, very difficult. I'm not saying it's not true, but it's very difficult what to do with this result. So what about matched cohort studies? Matched cohort studies are, in rule, retrospective, and you match exposed cases with non-exposed controls. The basic principle of a matched cohort study is that the cases and the controls should have an equal risk of having the infection and an equal risk of meeting the outcome, mortality. So crucial in this regard is the matching criteria. And what I would propose is that you match on the principal diagnosis of leading to ICU admission as close as possible. If not, you can use diagnostic category like medical or surgical, and surgical elective and surgical emergency. But if the patient is admitted for GI bleeding, please try to match him with a patient who was also admitted for gastrointestinal bleeding. If he was admitted for head trauma, and so on. This is extremely important in a matched cohort. Then, of course, you match on a disease classification score, such as SAPS-2, for instance. And I would also advise to match on exposure time, which means that your control patient should be in the ICU at least as long as the case patient before he or she developed a ventilator-associated pneumonia. And such an approach actually results in two groups of patients, one with FAP, without FAP, but in which the risk of FAP and the risk of death was a priori actually the same. This is the concept. Suppose you have a mortality of 60% among patients with VAP, and you have a control in which the mortality is 40%. This 40% is actually what you mean by general mortality due to general disease severity and acute illness, and the excess 20%, that's what you define as attributable mortality, because you see no other way then it can be just because of this one difference. But you can only say so if you matched very, very closely, and this is not always the case in literature. I just report two studies, the one from a Canadian group, 173 cases, 173 controls. You can match also 1 on 2 or 1 on 3 controls, of course. And this study took into account exposure time, Apache 2 score plus minus 4 points, which is actually already a lot if you ask me. They matched only on medical or surgical status, which I do not advise. I would advise to go in much more detail if you can. And actually, this study found an attributable mortality of 6%, which was not statistically significant. They did find a significant difference between medical patients in which they found 30% mortality versus 18% in the control group. I just selected this study. This is a matched cohort study taking into account ventilator-associated pneumonia that was exclusively caused by MRSA and exclusively treated by glycopeptides. Well-matched study on diagnostic category, Apache 2 score, and exposure time with a vast impact of the infection, attributable mortality 23%, and statistically significant, albeit that this study was not so very big in numbers of patients involved. So I just round up this matched cohort thing with an overview of some of the studies in a review paper from already 10 years ago. Many more came up, but I like this table because it illustrates that by using the same methodology, there can be some differences in matching criteria, but using basically the same methodology, you can have attributable mortality rates of 0% and 50%. Yeah. Is that good? Well, actually, I do think so, yes, I do think so, because I just refuse to believe that the impact of FAP universally is only 1 or 5 or 10%. I just refuse to believe that. It can differ according to your very specific situation, your case mix, etc., or your just general standard of care. I can believe that the impact of a catheter-related bloodstream infection in a country like France or Belgium is only 1 or 2%. But I do believe the result of some South American studies that report attributable mortalities for the same infection of 20%. I do think this is possible. So pros and cons of matched cohort studies to end with. Contra. Some people say that there is a tendency to an overestimation of the attributable mortality by this kind of research. However, there are studies with this kind of research, this approach, showing no attributable mortality. Most studies match on disease severity on admission. This might be an issue. However, I told you that SAPS2 or APACHE2 predicts mortality just on the basis of these first 24 hours. The reliability of the control group fully depends on the matching criteria. That's very important, very, very important. And of course, it is extremely time-consuming, I can tell you. What are the pros of matched cohort studies? Well, it is a very easy to understand concept. Even a logistic regression analysis, you put in your confounding variables and you click on OK and you just have no idea what will pop out. But with matched cohort studies, you have complete control and you have complete insight in what is happening in your approach. In addition, and this is an aspect that I like very much in matched cohort studies, albeit it's a very simple approach. If you match on diagnostic category and on SAPS2 score or APACHE2 score, you are capable of calculating the expected mortality. And when you have the expected mortality of the control group and you have the observed mortality of the control group, you can actually check your control group on his reliability. If the expected mortality is 25% and your control group has a mortality of 15%, you know that, I probably did something wrong. But if it matches 25, 24, 25, 26%, you know that this is a reliable control group. And you can probably rely on the differences observed between controls and cases. And the last point I already mentioned. So in conclusion, the estimates of attributable mortality depends on a lot of things that you should consider. We must recognize that more recent and much more advanced statistical methodology have a tendency to report lower impact on ventilator-associated pneumonia. However, one study may not fit all circumstances. As I told you, I just refuse to believe that. I do believe that VAP may impact at least in some ICUs. Take note as well that as medicine progresses, that the impact of very severe infections might indeed be lower than 10, 15, 20 years ago. We have made huge advances in the past 15 years in terms of treatment of severe infections and sepsis. So the overall recommendation is, even if the attributable mortality may be only 1%, stay investing in prevention and try to optimize your antimicrobial therapy. I thank you very much. Researcher at Ghent University, and in the past I did some work on estimating the impact of nosocomial infections in critically ill patients, albeit mostly in the field of bacteremia and candidemia and multi-drug resistance.